Just for wearing a hoodie and having dark skin, a black woman was dragged from her car at a packed intersection, her face slammed onto a scorching hot hood. The white cop growled. "There's got to be something in the trunk." He found nothing, but still cuffed her, smirking as he read out a bogus arrest. He thought she was an easy target, but she's the FBI's special agent in charge. "What state do you live in? Do cops get away with this where you are?" Watch till the end to see arrogance destroy a career in open court. The BMW's low hum was the only sound slicing through the velvet hush of a high-end neighborhood tucked deep in the northern edge of the city. Amara Blake sat behind the wheel, one hand lightly resting at 10 o'clock, her other brushing the soft leather of the console. It was past 10, the kind of late where even the streetlights seemed to blink slower. Houses here didn't whisper, they stared, silent in their modern elegance, framed in cold steel and glass. The night air was crisp, clinical, like the world had been freshly sterilized. She slowed at a four-way stop, glanced left, right, left again. No one. The navigation blinked. One more turn and she'd be back in her temporary condo. Her mind was somewhere else, tracing over details from a recent meeting. Her work never truly ended. Justice had no office hours. Then the lights hit. Blue, red, no siren, just the sudden splash of rotating dread flooding her rear-view mirror. She exhaled slowly, shifted into park, hands instinctively placed on the wheel, visible, as trained, as always. The patrol cruiser angled aggressively behind her, nearly brushing her bumper. The driver door cracked open, and a tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped out. Even in the dim glow, his gait was unmistakable, casual, rehearsed, too confident. His flashlight clicked on before he spoke. The beam sliced straight through the rear window, across the leather seats, and landed directly in Amara's eyes. No greeting, no standard approach. Just that light. She squinted but didn't flinch. The man stepped up to her window, leaned in just enough for her to see the stitching on his department-issued vest, the sheen on his badge, and the smirk barely tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Evening," he said, though his tone carried no courtesy. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Amara frowned. No probable cause, no explanation, no request for license or registration. Nothing procedural, just that beam, that smile, that voice loaded with something that wasn't quite contempt. Worse, it was amusement. "I'd like to know why I'm being asked to exit my car," she replied, voice firm, calm. Her tone had an edge that suggested this wasn't her first time, though this time was already different. The man chuckled, low, patronizing. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head like he was surveying livestock, stepped back once, and circled behind her car. The flashlight stayed on. Her heart rate stayed steady. Training. Decades of it. But even training couldn't sterilize that twist of unease curling at the base of her spine. The trunk latch clicked. Her blood chilled. He hadn't asked for consent, hadn't informed her of any suspicion, hadn't even mentioned a routine check. The man had bypassed every layer of standard engagement and gone straight to the trunk. Amara's hands twitched slightly on the steering wheel. She didn't move, couldn't. The moment stretched and twisted. The trunk lifted, mechanically, like a jaw unhinging in silence. The flashlight beam disappeared into the cavity. There was no sound for 3 seconds. Then a pause, audible, deliberate. The trunk closed softly, too softly. The man returned, his shadow slithering along the driver's side before he stopped just short of her window again. His voice came through the crack in the glass, barely above a whisper. "Chook, May man," he said, then smiled, sharp and without warmth. "Good luck." Amara stared at him, the light in her face again. He didn't flinch. His hand lingered near his belt, nowhere near his firearm, but close enough to make a point. Then, as he began to step away, he dropped the last shard. "Nice car," he said, his mouth twisting around the words like they were made of bile. Too nice for a dark-skinned lady, don't you think? He didn't wait for an answer. The cruiser door slammed, the engine rumbled, and the lights flicked off as the car rolled into the night like a wolf returning to its den. Amara didn't move for a full 30 seconds. Her breathing remained measured, but a single pulse hammered behind her right temple. No protocol, no citation, no reason, just a trunk opened without cause and closed like nothing had happened. And he hadn't even looked at her registration. She stepped out of the car, slowly, methodically, opened the trunk herself. There it was, a matte black pistol, barely visible in the corner pocket behind her emergency kit. He stared, not because she hadn't seen it before, but because only one person besides her had ever known where it was, and he hadn't even touched it. She didn't touch the gun, didn't need to. It was enough to see it, coiled in its hiding place like a planted seed waiting for the perfect storm. Amara Blake had trained herself to read the silence between actions, the invisible punctuation between moments where power declared itself without speaking. That night, as the cruiser vanished down the perfect slope of that pristine suburban street, she closed the trunk softly, climbed back into her BMW, and drove away with the precision of someone moving through a world she no longer trusted to obey its own rules. The letter came 2 mornings later, slipped between innocuous bank statements and glossy catalogs that no one requested. A plain envelope, government-sealed, bearing the thick-lined gravity of the United States District Court. She didn't open it in the hallway. She waited, sat at her kitchen table, steam from untouched coffee curling like breath from a beast that knew something bad had happened. Inside, a formal summons, charge, unlawful possession of a firearm. Her name, date of birth, and a docket number were typed with surgical neatness. She read it once, then again. The charge wasn't surprising, it was precise. The location listed? Her car. The item? A 9M semi-automatic. The supporting material included a still image, high-res, perfectly centered, showing the weapon nestled exactly where it had been, or where it had been placed. The timestamp was there, right on the bottom right corner. Down to the second. The lighting was impossibly even, as if the inside of her trunk had its studio crew. She stared at the picture, not because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't. She remembered that night in Blades, in fragments. The light, the smirk, the trunk opening without permission, but not a camera, and certainly not one that could have captured that angle. She opened her laptop and pulled up the dashcam file. There was a gap, 7 minutes of black screen, spliced cleanly between 2 normal segments. Too clean. No glitch markers, no static, just absence. Someone hadn't just deleted footage, they'd engineered the void. Meryl leaned back in her chair, heart steady. If this were an orchestration, someone had conducted it with an obsessive precision. She checked the signature on the summons. Assistant DA Michael Griggs. She knew that name. Clean record, upward trajectory, and, more importantly, an eagerness to play by the book so long as it advanced his career. She ran a quick search. Griggs had been promoted to temporary prosecutor oversight in Kellerman's precinct only 3 days prior. Too convenient. She clicked deeper. The summons was time-stamped at 8:03 a.m., the morning after the stop, less than 10 hours after the encounter. That wasn't justice. That was a script. The report also included forensic analysis. Traces of residue allegedly consistent with the pistol's magazine were found on the lining of her trunk. But the language used? Suggestive indicators and potential correlation. Vague, careful, almost afraid to be definitive. She had seen this kind of language before. Words chosen not to prove truth, but to insulate liability. She continued reading. The report also claimed soil residue, matching non- or native organic compounds, had been found on the soles of her shoes, consistent with rural mud samples. The photograph attached showed her heels in an evidence tray, labeled with a tag dated the night of the stop. The problem? That night, the pavement was dry. She hadn't stepped off the asphalt the entire evening, and she remembered her shoes. She always remembered the small things. She traced the paper trail backward. Griggs had signed the processing order, but the evidence intake officer's name was blurred, redacted, with an internal clearance marker that made no sense for a local firearms case. More importantly, the request to access Amara's trunk had not followed any standard procedure. There was no warrant listed, no request logged, no recorded consent. Just a note in the margins, visual confirmation of contraband, prompted immediate search. Visual confirmation? In a closed trunk? Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She let it ring, let it go quiet. She opened the image again, the gun in the trunk, and stared longer. There in the corner, a shadow that didn't belong, a shoe tip visible in the periphery, not hers. Kellerman's boots had a distinctive edge, military Polish with a sharp heel angle. She zoomed in, paused, saved the file. A fingerprint wouldn't do her any good right now, but a boot print might. Then the doorbell rang. She moved carefully, checked the hallway monitor. A young man in a Federal Courier uniform, thin, pale, nervous around the edges. She opened the door only halfway. "Delivery for Miss Blake?" he said. Not a question. His eyes flicked past her shoulder one beat too slow. Something danced at the edge of his professionalism. She took the envelope. "You with the bureau?" "No, ma'am," he replied too quickly. She nodded once, closed the door. Back at her table, she opened the second envelope. A courtesy notice. "You are scheduled for a preliminary appearance before the court on Tuesday 9:00 a.m. You are entitled to legal counsel." The words felt like theater, a rehearsal. She opened her laptop again and mapped out the chain of custody the report alluded to. The officer who processed the photo was unnamed. The timestamp on the photo was from a minute after the dashcam went dark. The forensic report was signed by someone she knew from another case, someone who had resigned 3 months ago. Someone had forged a ghost. She filed every document into encrypted folders, color-coded and renamed. She drafted a basic timeline. Stop, Friday night. Photo timestamp, 10:17 p.m. Dashcam blackout, 10:10 to 10:17 p.m. Summons issued, 8:03 a.m. Saturday. Processing report filed, Sunday. Forensics submitted, Monday. Court appearance scheduled, Tuesday. 4 days. It read less like an investigation and more like a staged production rehearsed to perfection. She didn't speak out loud, didn't curse, but inside her mind, gears were shifting. Kellerman hadn't needed her to say anything. He had never needed proof. He needed only silence, hers and the system's. The way he had walked, smiled, reached for the trunk without breaking stride, it hadn't been an impulse. It was protocol, his own. Still, a part of her wanted to believe this was isolated, rogue, but the language in the documents, the precision, the early morning summons, it had the rhythm of something systemic. She noted that too. And then there was the look on the face of the courier, not just fear, recognition. He knew who she was. And yet, he hadn't said her title. No one had. Not the summons, not the report, not the documents, just Amara Blake. No mention of the agency, no reference to internal affairs. As if someone needed her silenced, not just as a person, but as a concept. That told her something even deeper. Whoever had written this act already knew who they were performing for. And they knew the real danger wasn't in what Amara might say, but in what she might prove. There was something about the way silence sat in her apartment after the envelope, like a weight, just heavy enough to shift the gravity of the room. Amara didn't fill it with music. She didn't call anyone. She stared at the open laptop as if it might blink first, then shut it and stood up. The coffee had gone cold, the air had turned still, but her thoughts were sharp. She needed one thing, distant, not from the threat, but from the noise wrapped around it. So she moved. A low-profile cafe tucked into a forgotten cross street 2 miles from the courthouse. No signage, just frosted glass and a bell that didn't ring. Inside, the lighting was low, the clientele was non-existent. The barista didn't speak, didn't need to. She knew this place, had used it before. She chose a booth in the corner, facing the door. The chair across from her stayed empty for almost 7 minutes, just long enough for the street outside to forget she was there. Then, without warning, someone slid into the seat. Male, early 40s, thin frame, black coat, no scent. He placed a USB drive on the table between them with surgical precision, like a dealer placing a card that would end the hand. He didn't speak, didn't nod, just stood up and walked out. Amara didn't look at him as he left. She waited until the door shut behind him, then reached forward and took the drive in one smooth motion, sliding it into her inner jacket pocket. Back home, she locked the door, pulled the blinds halfway, and opened her laptop again. The folder read only, "Play Me." No password, no header, just a time-stamped WAV file and 2 PDFs. She played the audio first. The quality was low, background noise from what sounded like a ventilation shaft or a ceiling fan, but the voice that emerged cut through with surgical clarity. Male, confident, amused. "Put the piece in the trunk before she shows up. Leave it where it'll make her doubt herself first. She won't fight if she thinks it's her fault." Amara didn't blink. She increased the gain, enhanced the waveform. Another voice chimed in, female, clip, calculating. "And make sure the hallway camera logs stay offline. Last time it took 2 weeks to scrub it all. I don't want anyone asking about chain of custody again." The first voice laughed. "Please, these people only care when it happens to someone who looks like them." Another pause, then the female voice again. "When she gets to court, it has to be tight. The judge doesn't need the truth. He needs a clean line. I'll handle that." The audio was clipped off. No names, no direct references, but she didn't need them. She knew the voice, both of them. Brent Kellerman and Linda Cole. The PDF files were next. The first, a schematic, floor plan of the city courthouse. Each hallway is labeled in numeric code, red X's marked over 3 camera placements, each one bearing the words manual, anodimo, internal only. One hallway in particular showed an annotation in a different font, 1108. Mark 1117 blackout requested. The exact time frame her dash cam had gone dark. The second PDF was an internal email. No sender name, but the domain flagged immediately at internal.courtgov. The text was short, a string of phrases cobbled together with bureaucratic venom. Subject has been identified as the control case, Phase 2 contingent on no internal dissent. Modify the narrative if necessary, ensure she doubts the origin, leak the photo file early, delay legal objection. Scramble chain of custody with indirect authentication. The IP address was embedded in the file metadata. She traced it. Internal server, courthouse mainframe, not spoofed, real. Amara sat still, not because she was surprised, but because it was all too clean. The problem with truth is that it rarely arrives in perfect shape. It's fragmented, messy, always bleeding at the edges. But this was an operation, not a rogue cop gone wild, not an overzealous ADA chasing glory. This had coordination, timing, and infrastructure. It smelled like protocol wrapped in plausible deniability. She ran the audio through 2 spectrograms, matched the waveform to archived deposition footage. No question, Kellerman's vocal patterns, the male laughter, and Cole's distinct cadence, precise and laced with what could only be described as curated superiority. She burned a backup copy, air-gapped it, then sent a dummy file to a decoy drive. This wasn't about proving she was innocent. This was about understanding how many people had already decided she was guilty before the evidence existed, before the summons was signed, before the night even began. She leaned forward and stared at the schematic again. The hallway outside courtroom 3A had a red X. She highlighted it. That's where she'd be brought in on Tuesday. She minimized the window, pulled up her database, entered Kellerman's badge number, something only internal affairs had clearance to access, something only she could see flagged inactive for temporary internal reassignment. The date was the same morning the audio was timestamped. That wasn't a coincidence. That was containment. She dug deeper. Background traffic through DOJ's secure shell showed an encrypted message sent from the courthouse's internal server to an unlisted mailbox under the username LCOL_42. The file was marked confidential. Phase 2 initiated. She noted the timestamp, matched it against the moment the email with her summons had been logged into the system. Someone had pulled the trigger on her case before they even finished loading the gun. She closed the laptop, sat back, and exhaled. This wasn't a legal action. This was a stress test. On her, on the system, on what might break first. There was no question anymore. She was inside the machine. The only thing left unclear was whether she had walked in or had always been part of its design. The courthouse rose like a slab of gray stone against a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or burn. Amara arrived just before dawn, stepping through the side entrance reserved for named defendants and personnel with clearance. No cameras waited for her outside, but she knew better than to assume discretion. Silence wasn't safety. It was often choreography. Inside, the halls pulsed with a particular kind of energy, performative restraint. Court officers pretended not to notice the increased presence of media personnel whispering into lapel mics. The court reporter adjusting her glasses with more tension than necessary, the bailiff polishing his badge like he expected it to be photographed. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. No one knew exactly what. That was the point. Courtroom 3A was colder than she remembered it, not in temperature, but in tone. Chairs aligned in perfect geometry, screens positioned at angles that favored spectators more than justice. Amara sat in the defendant's chair. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. Her posture was upright, composed, the very picture of someone who had not come to beg, but to observe. The room filled slowly, deliberately. Linda Cole entered first, her heels clicking like a metronome for control. Her face was unreadable, not emotionless, but overtrained into the exact mask of neutrality demanded. She took her place at the prosecution's table, opened a leather binder, and didn't look at Amara, but her head tilted just slightly when Brent Kellerman walked in. He entered not like a man accused of procedural misconduct, but like a keynote speaker prepared for a standing ovation. Crisp navy suit, not a wrinkle in sight. Tie tightened to a surgical degree. He adjusted his collar once, just once, before taking the stand, greeted with a nod from the presiding judge, who didn't smile, but didn't scowl either. That was telling. Then he began. From the first word, it was clear Kellerman had rehearsed every breath. His tone carried a professional sorrow, like this whole mess burdened him more than anyone else in the room. He walked through the night in question with absurd detail, down to the angle of Amara's headlights, the time code when he spotted her car turning left at an intersection. 10:09 p.m. precisely, Your Honor, and the supposed glint of suspicion in her gaze as she reached for the steering wheel. He described the encounter as if he had lived it 1,000 times, sculpting memory into a weapon. She avoided eye contact in a way that suggested concealment. I was trained to notice these things, he said, each word gliding out like a courtroom lullaby. Then came the jewel of his testimony, his recollection of what he found in the trunk. He detailed the weapon's position, the light's reflection on the slide, and even added it was nestled among personal items, but not hidden, almost like it belonged there. Linda Cole didn't interrupt him once. But after every major claim, after every timestamp, every forensic assumption, she nodded. Not dramatically, just enough. A rhythm, a signal. Amara watched silently, not his words, his fingers. They tapped the edge of the witness stand in triplets, always after delivering a key phrase. It was subtle, almost benign, but to her it was a metronome of manipulation, a tactic. At one point, he described her expression. Her eyes were tense, like she was calculating something, and her hands trembling, just slightly. As I approached the trunk, the gallery murmured. He let the silence stretch, then added, "It's the kind of body language we're trained to flag as evasive." Amara's hands had not trembled. The judge didn't question it. No one did. The cross-examination was waived. The defense elects to reserve, her attorney said flatly, following her lead. This wasn't the moment for resistance. Not yet. This was a reveal. As the prosecution wrapped up the testimony, Cole rose. Her voice was smooth, dry. Officer Kellerman's conduct remains consistent with departmental protocol. The absence of a warrant, while notable, is superseded by probable cause, established through direct visual observation. She paused, then added, as supported by the defendant's reaction. Amara looked at her, not blinking. Linda continued, when a citizen reacts with hostility to a lawful inquiry, it invites suspicion. Officer Kellerman's instinct may have saved lives, and in this instance, uncovered a federal offense. Every sentence fell with the sterile force of institutional logic. Then she stepped back, rested her hands on the desk, and looked down, not at her notes, but at Kellerman's reflection on the polished wood surface. He was smiling, but not at her. At the judge, that's when Amara's breath caught, not in panic, but in realization. This wasn't about her. Not really. She had never been the story. She was the stage. Each player hit their marks with flawless precision. No objections, no deviation. Even the court reporter typed as if she already knew the lines. The judge leaned forward, shuffled papers, and cleared his throat. Given the nature of the evidence and the consistent testimony from law enforcement, the court finds sufficient grounds to proceed with formal charges. A camera shutter clicked. Cole nodded. Kellerman exhaled, slowly, controlled. And Amara? She looked down at the table, at Kellerman's rhythmically tapping fingers, and saw it. 3 taps, pause, 1 tap, repeated. A signal. To whom? Her eyes flicked left. One of the jury members, a man in a taupe suit, blinked in perfect sync, then looked away. Amara felt the room shrink, not in size, but in honesty. There were no cracks in their story, because the story wasn't built to be tested. It was built to be performed. She didn't say a word, didn't move, but inside her, the calculus began. Every second, every look, every breath logged, because what they hadn't rehearsed, what they hadn't prepared for, was the difference between watching someone crumble and watching someone collect, and she was collecting everything. The rhythm of Kellerman's fingers stayed with her long after the courtroom emptied. It echoed not in her ears, but somewhere deeper, like a phantom pulse beneath the skin. Each tap had been deliberate, mechanical, a language only the initiated understood. She didn't need to decode it yet, not when other frequencies were already beginning to bleed through the noise. The envelope arrived with no return address, no seal, and no postmark. It was slipped under her office door at 3:17 a.m.ing, time-stamped only by the surveillance camera across the hallway. That camera, she later discovered, had gone black for exactly 3 minutes. The same 3 minutes the building's backup server showed a spike in signal traffic rerouted through an encrypted proxy loop originating from a satellite relay node based just outside Langley. Inside the envelope was a USB drive, black, unmarked, with only one line etched into its metallic casing in faint silver ink. IA 872. No name, no rank, no accompanying note. She locked her door, drew the blinds, shut down every networked device in the room, then pulled out a cold laptop she never connected to any known server. She inserted the drive and waited. The folder contained 2 files. The first, surveillance extract _ camera 14A. The second, audio X _ clip 32 _ direct. She opened the video first. The footage was raw, colorless, but the metadata was intact. 10:10 p.m. to 10:17 p.m., the same time frame her dash cam had blacked out. The camera, mounted high in the hallway of the district courthouse, captured nothing at first, just empty walls, the soft pulse of security strobes blinking silently. Then the feed cut to static. It didn't glitch, it didn't fail. It went deliberately black for 6 minutes and 42 seconds, then returned as cleanly as it had disappeared. She replayed it 3 times, frame by frame. There were no signs of tampering because the tampering hadn't been concealed. It had been permitted. She opened the second file. The audio crackled softly, the compression heavy, the voices distant but unmistakable. The first voice, Linda Cole, sharp, cold, completely devoid of tension. "We can't let the judge see the raw feed. The placeholder will hold. Tell Kellerman to stick to the sequence we drafted. A second voice, muffled, likely Kellerman, responded with a chuckle. He won't ask questions. He wants this off his docket fast. He'll read whatever we write. Then Cole, again, clearer, clipped, good. That buys us time. Make sure the chain of custody docs get the right timestamps. Not accurate. Just clean. I'm not here to prove guilt. I'm here to erase doubt. The line was cut. Amara froze the audio file at the 4:11 mark, rewound, listened again. The phrase hadn't just been administrative, it had been confessional. I'm not here to prove guilt. I'm here to erase doubt, a doctrine of manipulation stated without apology. She checked the properties of the files, encrypted twice. The codec used on the audio was government level, repurposed from an internal surveillance platform normally reserved for tactical ops, known only as SHD-7, a protocol flagged for use exclusively within internal affairs at the federal level. She recognized it because she had access to it once, only once. She ran a passive signature scan on the USB. It had been formatted using an agency toolset not available to civilian or state departments. One line in the metadata confirmed it. Asset deployment, third-party recon, authorization, IA 872. It wasn't a leak, it was a message. She minimized the windows and leaned back. Someone had just handed her the blade, not to stab, but to weigh. The I-872 wasn't a name, it was a code name, a ghost designation. She ran it against internal records, non-existent. Not because it had never existed, but because it had been scrubbed. That kind of erasure only happened when someone went dark by design. And whoever they were, they had access, unfiltered, untraceable, and fluent in the architecture of the cover-up. They didn't send help. They sent proof, the kind of proof that couldn't be refuted in court because it had never been meant to exist in the first place. She reopened the folder. Hidden inside the file structure was a third item, topology grid _ transfer node 17pp. A schematic? She recognized the structure immediately, the routing diagram for the courthouse's surveillance infrastructure, a crisscross of fiber optic channels, failover loops, and backup archives rerouted through a node labeled SRV-INT4, a server housed not in the city's jurisdiction, but physically relocated to a federal archive vault beneath the DOJ's regional hub. They hadn't just erased the original footage, they had diverted the entire surveillance chain. She traced the flow of data backward. Every branch in the grid pointed to a convergence node marked with a symbol, a hexagon bisected by 3 lines. It was a code used only in IA-level operational architecture, designated for black channel data exchanges in high-risk investigations. She knew that code because she had used it before. Her phone buzzed once. No number, just a message. Watch your 6 and don't act grateful. They'll see it. 872. She didn't smile. She didn't panic. She saved the files to a biometric secured drive and snapped the USB in half. The motherboard is split clean, no trace. She stepped outside into the hallway, where the lights seemed brighter than they should have been. An intern passed her, smiled, then glanced too quickly at the ceiling cam before continuing. She watched him vanish around the corner. They were still watching, but now she knew someone else was watching them. The system wasn't just corrupt, it was layered. But somewhere beneath the rot, a hand had moved. And whether it moved for justice, survival, or something in between, it had moved for her. For now, the message from 872 still burned cold behind her ribs when Amara stepped back into courtroom 3A. This time, though, the air tasted different. Not heavy like defeat, not sharp like fear, but charged with the quiet static of an impending shift. She crossed the room like someone who knew the stage had cracked beneath the feet of those who thought they were untouchable. The judge didn't look up. Linda Cole sat in her usual posture of calculated neutrality. Kellerman stood stiff at the front, crisp and pressed as ever, but his fingers no longer tapped in tempo. They faltered, slower now, uneven. Amara spoke first, not loudly, but with the kind of authority that cleared the silence. "Your Honor," she said, voice level and unhurried, "I'm requesting direct cross-examination. in light of inconsistencies not yet addressed. The room paused. Cole's eyes flicked upward just once. The judge gave a simple nod. Amara stood. She didn't shuffle notes or ask to approach. She walked to the center like it was hers already. "Officer Kellerman," she began, cool and clinical, "let's revisit your earlier testimony. You claim to have identified me by reading the nameplate on my jacket. That's correct?" "Yes," Kellerman replied, too fast. "That's standard." Amara nodded, then tapped a key. On the projection screen, a still from the dashcam appeared, Amara illuminated by headlight glare, the nameplate blown out by reflection, unreadable. "Would you agree this is authentic dash footage?" "It appears to be." "Then explain," she continued, pressing another key, "how the prosecution's Exhibit A, submitted as your identifying image, shows my badge perfectly visible, crisp and glare-free under supposedly identical lighting." A new image filled the screen, a new cleaning. Kellerman's jaw tensed. "Maybe the angle." "There was one camera," she cut in, voice still composed. "Yours." He said nothing. She pivoted. "Next," she said, projecting another photo, a shot of the trunk latch. "This shows the entry point, correct?" "Yes." "And this," she held up a report, "confirms the only fingerprints on that latch were yours?" "Because I opened it," he replied. "She refused consent. You stated under oath that you had probable cause, not that consent was refused," she said flatly. "You also said she was evasive, implying guilt. So tell me, if I planted that weapon, why didn't I touch the latch?" "Not once." He blinked, said nothing. She continued, "Your Honor, the defense notes that the only physical evidence connecting anyone to that trunk is the officer's fingerprint, no others." The judge shifted slightly. "One last blow. You testified the incident occurred Friday the 10th, correct?" Kellerman nodded. "Yes." Amara smiled, slowly and controlled. "Friday was the 9th. The silence cracked, then snapped. Kellerman stammered. "I must have misremembered." "Strange," Amara murmured, for someone so precise with timestamps. Cole's posture remained still, but her fingers clenched tightly, knuckles whitening. Amara returned to her seat without looking back. She didn't need to. She had already sliced through the surface. The system hadn't shattered, not yet, but today flinched. The room hadn't exhaled since Amara sat down. The silence still shimmered from her final line like heat over pavement. Kellerman hadn't moved. Cole hadn't blinked. The judge scribbled something into the margin of a folder, though even he seemed unsure what to do with it. The gallery, for all its murmurs before, now held still, as if gravity itself had thickened. And then the moment broke. A sharp flutter of paper echoed from the prosecution table, subtle, but wrong. Linda Cole, who had not shifted since the start of the hearing, reached calmly into her binder. But as she pulled one of the folders open, her grip faltered, or perhaps her restraint gave out, just slightly. A single metallic clink rang out, unmistakable. A gun fell. It slid off the top of the evidence stack with a sickening grace, striking the table's edge before tumbling down and tapping the court microphone with a high, hollow note that carried farther than any sentence spoken that morning. The sound was sharp enough to draw breath from every corner of the room. Even the judge looked up. Amara didn't move at first. She simply turned her head, measured, deliberate. Her eyes caught the arc of the weapon lying next to the mic. Its barrel pointed nowhere and everywhere at once. She stood. One motion, controlled. Her voice, when it came, was clear. "I've never seen that firearm before," she said. No hesitation, no waver, just the simple weight of truth, declared aloud for all to witness. The judge shifted again, clearly caught between instinct and instruction. "Ms. Cole," he said, his voice struggling to find the usual balance of authority. Cole didn't answer immediately. She leaned forward, slowly, as if inspecting something beneath her dignity. Her face remained blank, too blank. "Apologies, Your Honor," she finally said. "It must have been misfiled." A beat of silence. Amara stepped forward. "I request immediate analysis of that weapon for biological trace evidence, DNA, skin cells, anything. If it's legitimate, it should be able to speak for itself." The judge opened his mouth, then closed it again. This wasn't in the script. This hadn't been rehearsed. From the back of the courtroom, someone coughed, not just a sound, but a reaction, and then another. A woman in the jury box leaned sideways and whispered something to the man beside her. He didn't respond at first, then slowly turned to her and whispered back. Something had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the equilibrium of performance had cracked. Amara watched it happen. She saw the weight shift, the way the jurors, one by one, became less statues and more people. Thinking people, watching people. Third whisper. This one is from a younger man near the far end of the panel. He didn't look at anyone as he said it, but someone heard. And then another voice, quiet, a female juror. There's something wrong here. The mic picked it up, not perfectly, but enough. Cole's eyes flicked upward, not in panic, but in irritation. Amara turned to the judge. If we are to maintain the integrity of these proceedings, I recommend the evidence handling chain be reviewed in full. That includes item acquisition, storage, and courtroom transport. Given what we just witnessed, a break-in protocol is no longer hypothetical. It's visible. The judge nodded slowly, reluctant, but without ground to refuse. Motion granted, he said. We'll reconvene following preliminary review. But the words didn't have their usual weight, because something deeper had already taken hold. The courtroom didn't just pause, it thought, and that was more dangerous than anything Amara could have forced with shouting. She returned to her seat. Cole straightened her notes mechanically, as if she could paste the seams of the moment back together through sheer posture. But even she knew this wasn't about documents anymore. The gun had made a sound, the kind that couldn't be unheard. The gun still rested at the edge of the table when court reconvened, silent but screaming louder than any testimony. The air held a tautness that even the most seasoned courtroom regulars could not ignore. Jurors shifted in their seats but didn't speak. Linda Cole sat with her spine perfectly straight, her expression unreadable, while Kellerman stood at the front, his posture firm but no longer natural, as though he was remembering how to breathe. No one noticed Amara Blake rise. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't need it. She walked forward with the kind of calm that made people lean back. I have something to add, she said, not loud but crisp and unshakable. The judge's brow lifted, halfway between confusion and authority, but before he could protest, she reached into her jacket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the badge. It gleamed under the lights, steel against stillness, reflecting off the polished table and flashing across Kellerman's eyes. Special agent in charge, she said, holding it high, steady as stone. Internal Affairs Division, FBI. The gasp that followed felt involuntary. A phone clattered from the gallery, landing face down near the jury box. Kellerman flinched. Amara's voice didn't rise, but each word landed like a hammer. You thought you were testifying against me. You thought you were in control, but you're not. I'm not your defendant. I'm your investigator. The silence cracked. Kellerman staggered back a half step, his confidence punctured, spine retreating from the blow. You thought this was your courtroom, she continued. Gaze locked on his. But it's mine now. I've been watching you, recording you, analyzing every word. Your time-stamped, your camera malfunctions, your fingerprints on evidence only you touched. She turned toward Cole. And you, she said, you signed off on the chain of custody. You controlled what the judge saw. You filtered reality until it was sanitized and sterile. Cole clenched her jaw. Her hand rose to her chin, digging in as if to keep herself from shaking. Her eyes didn't blink. You made sure the clean version stuck, Amara said, coldly. But I was never playing the role you gave me. I was preparing the one you never saw coming. She lowered the badge, sliding it back into her jacket like a blade she was done showing. This courtroom isn't the stage you think it is. It's a crime scene, and I'm here to name the perpetrators. Kellerman's composure collapsed further. His shoulders sagged, his breath caught shallow. Cole's lips parted, but no words came out. The judge, visibly shaken, opened his mouth as if to call order, but said nothing. The cameras, long ignored, now pulsed with red recording lights. One juror muttered, "Did you know this?" Another whispered back, "No, none of us did." The tension fractured into quiet chaos. A man dropped a tablet, A woman in the second row covered her mouth. Amara sat back down with the calm of someone who didn't need to raise her voice because her silence now said everything. The truth didn't need volume, it just needed to be seen. The room hadn't recovered. The badge still echoed in their eyes, the words still rang in their ears, and the hierarchy they'd all clung to like scripture had just crumbled under the weight of something colder, heavier, truth. Amara sat motionless, but not still. She was a storm in perfect containment. The judge tried to clear his throat. Cole shifted paper that didn't need shifting. Kellerman stared at the floor as if it might open and swallow him whole. The courtroom's center of gravity had moved, and it was sitting in Amara Blake's chair. She rose again. No drama, no fanfare. Just inevitability. I now move to enter into public record a directive authorized under Title V, Section 1213 of the United States Code, Federal Whistleblower Protection and Agency Oversight, she said, projecting not volume, but velocity. Under said authority, I am disclosing a full and active investigation into procedural corruption within the jurisdiction of this courtroom, involving 2 federal officers, 1 state prosecutor, and several unnamed participants under sealed review. Gasps. She stepped forward, a single sheet of paper in her hand, the official watermark faint but unmistakable under courtroom lights. She held it up, not to show off, but to mark the line between performance and accountability. This is a DOJ-issued investigative order, she continued, signed 6 months ago by the Assistant Attorney General. It authorizes the immediate review and seizure of any materials related to the matter of fabricated evidence, obstruction of justice, and coordinated malfeasance related to the unlawful targeting of internal control agents embedded in public infrastructure. No one spoke, because no one could. She approached the bench, handed the order to the clerk with the kind of precision that said she had done this before and would do it again. This court was never supposed to try me, she said, her voice now like ice pressed against steel. It was constructed to test the integrity of the system itself, and it failed, repeatedly, knowingly, with full cooperation from those who should have been its guardians. She reached into a small folder, produced a flash drive, and, without a word, connected it to the courtroom projection system. No one stopped her, because what could they say? The screen flickered. The audio file began, crackling at first, then clear, as a man's voice, recognizable, confident, disgustingly casual. She's the bait. If she pushes, we burn her like the rest. If not, great, we log her name and move on. Then a woman's voice, clinical, Linda Cole. Just make sure the judge never sees the raw copy. Give him the scrubbed file and wrap it in some policy justification. You've done it before, do it again. The silence that followed was nuclear. Amara looked at the judge, who could no longer hide behind his robe or his rules. That audio, she said slowly, was captured on an encrypted line by an embedded IA operative, time-stamped, authenticated, cross-referenced by 3 separate forensic chains. She turned to face the courtroom, not just the prosecution. Everything you've heard today isn't a fluke. It's a pattern we've traced across 6 districts, 7 courtrooms, and a dozen careers. Mine just happened to be the one you thought wouldn't fight back. Linda Cole finally spoke, but her voice cracked under the weight of its design. This is an ambush. This is theater. You can't. Amara cut her off with a glance, and that glance said everything. Oh, the kind of look that isn't a warning but a sentence. I don't need your permission to expose your crimes, she said, and you don't get to choose when justice arrives. That's the difference between power and law. One bends, the other breaks. Kellerman tried to stand, then sat again. His face had gone the color of paper. The judge stared at the paper in front of him, the DOJ seal glaring back at him like a mirror he never wanted to face. Mara continued, voice unwavering. You built this courtroom to prosecute what you didn't understand. You filled it with confidence and rehearsed control. But justice doesn't rehearse. It arrives. The air shifted again, And this time, it wasn't tension, it was recoil. The entire room now stood at a distance from itself, no longer believing in what it had seen, no longer trusting the script. The judge looked up, finally. He cleared his throat. Due to the seriousness of the revelations presented and the security implications involved, I am ordering a 15-minute recess for administrative review and safety protocol alignment. His voice was thin, brittle. No one objected. They couldn't. The court clerk rose. The seal of the court flickered on the screens, and as the judge exited the bench, shoulders hunched, Amara remained standing, not triumphant, not satisfied, just resolve. Because from this moment forward, the courtroom didn't belong to the system, it belonged to her. Amara hadn't moved. The judge had left the bench. The gallery had dissolved into a cloud of whispers, and the seal of the court still glowed faintly on the screens. But she remained where she was, grounded and unshaken, the only still point in a room trying not to fall apart. She didn't need to speak again. The weight of her words still hung in the air like ash after ignition. The bailiff approached Kellerman with the quiet, rehearsed calm of someone trained for bureaucratic violence. "You are required to surrender your badge," he said, tone flat. Official, no emotion, just the mechanics of justice grinding into motion. Kellerman blinked like a man surfacing too fast. He reached for the badge, fingers trembling slightly, unfastened it and held it for a second longer than necessary, then placed it in the open hand before him like a relic he finally understood had lost its power. The sound of it, metal on palm, was small but definitive. Linda Cole stood, not slowly, not quickly, just with force. She gathered her files, yanked them into a stack that nearly burst from its clips, and stormed out of the courtroom. The door didn't swing, it slammed. In the hallway, she found the first table she could and brought the whole file down on it with a crack that echoed back inside. Witnesses flinched. One journalist's pen paused in mid-air. Another turned just in time to catch the final seconds of her composure unraveling on camera. Inside the courtroom, the tremor continued. A juror, a woman in her early 40s, clean blazer, steady eyes, rose slowly. She looked at the judge's empty bench, then at Amara. "Your Honor," she said to no one, then turned to the bailiff. "I'd like to be removed from the jury. I no longer trust the impartiality of this process." Silence. Then another voice. Seconded. The bailiff didn't argue. He just nodded and wrote their names down. Outside, a click of the shutter, then another. From the top row of the gallery, a young man with a press badge caught it. The shot. Amara stood at ease, head high, the court seal glowing behind her, the badge still visible on her lapel like a quiet rebellion made flesh. That photo would go viral in less than 3 minutes. But the caption would come first. The video clip hit social media before the judge returned. Just 28 seconds long, the badge reveal, the gun on the table, Amara's voice, sharp as a razor, "I'm not your defendant, I'm your investigator," followed by Kellerman's face breaking under the weight of what he could no longer deny. The clip spread with algorithmic speed, thousands of retweets in under 10 minutes, then tens of thousands, then more. And then came the hashtag, "You framed the wrong woman." It started as a single comment on a live stream thread. Then someone turned it into a quote tweet. Then it appeared on TikTok videos overlaid with footage from courtroom artists sketching Amara's profile in graphite and ink. Someone made a poster. Someone else made a shirt. The phrase climbed trending lists across every major platform. By noon, it was on the evening news. By nightfall, it was global. Inside the courthouse, the staff could feel it. Phones started vibrating nonstop. News alerts stacked like dominoes. Legal analysts scrambled for statements. PR reps from the Department of Justice made vague promises of full reviews and accountability. An entire generation of political interns began rewriting memos they hadn't planned to revise until election season. And still, Amara hadn't said a word, because she didn't have to. Her silence had already set a chain reaction into motion, one designed not to detonate but to collapse structure by structure, lie by lie. Cole, now 2 hallways away, paced like a ghost trying to remember how she died. Her phone buzzed 3 times in 10 seconds. She looked at the screen. Headlines were already live. Federal agent reveals internal cover-up, mid-trial. Badge, bullet, and truth. One woman's stand. Her face was on the thumbnail. So was the gun. So was Kellerman's. In the Department of Justice's press room, a junior correspondent for CNN rehearsed the lead-in, in what legal scholars are already calling one of the most significant reversals of prosecutorial narrative in modern U.S. history. She paused, took a breath, looked back at the monitor. We have confirmation that Special Agent Amara Blake's operation was sanctioned at the highest levels of internal affairs and has been active for over 6 months, right under the jurisdiction of the same courtroom where she stood accused. The clip played behind her. The badge, the pause, the line, "I'm not your defendant," and then the hashtag white on black. You framed the wrong woman. In offices across the Capitol, emails flew. Federal oversight teams were mobilized. Civil rights watchdogs began cross-referencing every case that had passed through Cole's hands over the last 5 years. Kellerman's record, once sealed tight, was now being decrypted line by line. Every skipped disciplinary review, every redirected complaint, every quiet reassignment that suddenly looked like a cover-up. One watchdog group filed a Freedom of Information request so fast it made the news cycle twice. And the people, they didn't riot. They didn't scream. They shared. They posted. They responded. Because when someone finally puts words to the thing everyone has felt but never dared to name, it doesn't sound like protest. It sounds like release. And Amara Blake had just opened that door. She stood in the hallway now, back straight, shoulders level. The camera lights followed her like gravity, but she didn't flinch. She didn't wave. She didn't speak to the press. She simply walked, slow and unafraid, through a crowd that had once come to witness her fall and now parted to make way for her rise. In a matter of hours, everything had shifted. Kellerman was no longer a cop. Cole was no longer untouchable. The courtroom was no longer neutral. And Amara? She was no longer the accused. She was the reckoning. The air inside the federal hearing room didn't move. It didn't hum. It didn't breathe. It braced. Concrete walls, reinforced doors, acoustic panels that absorbed noise and heat and judgment. There were no gallery seats, no cameras, no media presence to spin a narrative from nuance. Just sealed names, elevated clearances, and a silence that waited to be pierced. Amara stood before the room of internal affairs officers, DOJ appointees, and high-level FBI observers, not as the accused, not even as the witness, but as the architect of what came next. She no longer needed the badge to speak for her. The evidence would do that now. Her tone was not theatrical. She didn't perform. She stated, documented, delivered. Internal Affairs Case File IA 2033, she said. Voice even, firm, without excess. Primary charges: abuse of authority, fabrication of evidence, obstruction of interagency oversight. Secondary implications include racial targeting, prosecutorial collusion, and willful suppression of prior misconduct complaints. The screen behind her flickered on with a digital buzz. A schematic of the courthouse security system appeared, color-coded, annotated, and time-stamped. She moved the presentation forward. The security feed timelines, logs of corrupted file sequences, and error reports, all traced to one central switch node housed not in the server room, but in the judge's private network zone. One click and the feed spiked, then went dark. Exactly the minute Kellerman's stop took place. This was no glitch, Amara continued. This was a surgical blackout, executed internally. The manual override was keyed by an administrative access badge belonging to Chief Prosecutor Linda Cole, authorized under emergency conditions that were never declared. You'll find the time code matches her swipe log. Not a whisper from the table. She clicked forward. Audio files began to play. Compressed, clipped, but unmistakable. Kellerman's voice, half muttered, half bragging. Just stash it where she won't notice. She'll think she left it herself. When they pop the trunk, boom, there it is. Easy. Then Cole's voice, icy, dismissive, calculating. The judge doesn't get the real footage. We stick to the edit. Trust me, we've done this before. She's just the test case. That word echoed in the room. Test. Amara waited, then dropped the next slide. The email. Subject line. IA redact draft. Do not distribute. Sender. lindr.cole@doj.gov. Recipient kellerman.bray@local.gov. Excerpt. This one's ideal. High profile enough to send a message, expendable enough to burn. If she bites, we set the precedent. If she folds, even better. No one blinked. She clicked again. Kellerman's misconduct record, previously sealed. 15 internal complaints over 9 years, all dismissed or unfounded. 6 disciplinary referrals, 3 suppression requests, all intercepted and shut down by Cole's office before they reached review. Slide. The cover memo, signed by Cole, recommending Kellerman for commendation. Days after an excessive force allegation was filed by a civilian, the internal justification reads, Kellerman's assertive field presence compensates for procedural gaps. Slide. Transcript of a closed-door meeting pulled from voice assist logs synced to Cole's government-issued phone, stored off-click, recovered through judicial subpoena. Date, 3 weeks before my stop. Verbatim quote, "We need someone public, someone who can take the optics. She's articulate, clean record, respected, but she's not one of us. That's the risk, that's the edge." Slide. A new column appeared on the screen. 7 names, 7 dates, 7 file IDs. These, Amara said, are the cases preceding mine. Each defendant was flagged for aggressive sentencing. Each incident is tied to an ambiguous traffic stop, all documented as routine until deeper audit revealed identical patterns, falsified timestamps, spliced footage, chain of custody inconsistencies. Her voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it deepened. In one case, a public defender was later disbarred for trying to reopen evidence. In another, a judge retired mid-investigation without explanation. These aren't anomalies. They are protocols, unwritten, untraceable, but systemic. One of the committee members shifted in his seat. Another cleared his throat, but didn't speak. "This isn't about Kellerman anymore," she said. "He was never the mind, he was the weapon. The logic behind this, the scaffolding, that's Cole. And the people above her who saw the numbers, who saw the data trends and did nothing. Or worse, called it necessary maintenance." She paused. And 33 is not a rogue event. It is institutional calculus. She turned off the screen, let the room breathe it in. Then, calmly, she pulled a slim, bound file from her briefcase and placed it on the center table. It wasn't thick, but it was dense. "This is my full report," she said. "Documented, time-stamped, corroborated, and sealed under dual encryption protocol. I'm submitting it to the DOJ Oversight Division under Section 7.14 of the Federal Code of Internal Review. I request immediate protective designation for the witnesses listed on page 4. You'll find sworn statements from 2 former DOJ analysts, 1 courthouse IT lead, and 1 paralegal who worked Cole's docket rotation. Another file followed. This one is thicker, blue tab, red stamp. "This," she said, "is the case expansion. 7 additional victims. Same pattern, same fingerprints, figurative and literal. Same suppression playbook. I want their files reopened. I want their names cleared. And I want a full audit of Cole's tenure. You'll find the forensic analysis appended." Finally, she placed a USB on top of both. Security footage, system logs, and 5 years' worth of internal communications from Cole's office. You'll want to check the folder labeled "Do Not Forward." It's a goldmine. And with that, Amara stepped back. No raised voice, no grandstanding. Just a sequence of facts, so precise, so corrosive, it didn't require embellishment. Because this was no longer a courtroom battle. This was an execution of systemic reveal, and the room knew it. One of the senior agents leaned in, staring at the data like it might burst into flame. Another opened the folder, scanned the first few pages, then pushed back in his chair, exhaling slowly, almost in disbelief. A voice at the end of the table finally spoke. "What do you call this, Agent Blake?" She looked him straight in the eye. I call it what it is. Not misconduct, not corruption, not biased. I call it engineered injustice. Silence. Then the chair of the review panel turned to the team. Motion to initiate emergency audit protocol. All in favor? He said. Every hand rose. The silence inside the closed hearing room didn't last long. By the time Amara stepped out of that federal building, the world outside had already started to tilt. Someone, no one knew exactly who, clipped together 47 seconds of courtroom footage and uploaded it. The camera caught it all. The cold flash of her badge, the sharp metallic clatter of the gun hitting the microphone, and her voice, steady and low, echoing through a room that had spent hours trying to bury her. The voice was pure Italy, accents and ritual chuckling that Noelle could hear. "You think you're trying me," she had said, "but I'm the one investigating you." That line alone was enough to make the ground shift. Within an hour, it was on Twitter. Within 3, it hit 1 million views. By the end of the night, it was everywhere. The clip was shared on every major news network, embedded in articles and turned into a dozen different memes. The most viral one showed Amara frozen mid-Magner, badge raised like a weapon, Kellerman in the background half-turned and unsteady, a look of sheer disbelief cracking through his composure. In block white text it read, "She brought facts, they brought lies." The hashtag appeared almost instantly. "You framed the wrong woman." It began as a whisper, a murmur under posts and comment threads, then turned into a storm. Within 4 hours, it was trending #1 worldwide. Verified accounts, politicians, celebrities, journalists, everyone had something to say. Some called her a hero. Others warned that this was just the tip of a poisoned iceberg. But most agreed on one thing: something had broken loose, and it wasn't going back. The 47 seconds sparked a wildfire. Hundreds of news outlets embedded the clip into their lead stories. Primetime anchors played it on repeat, pausing at the flash of the badge, the thud of the gun, the moment Kellerman's smug facade cracked like cheap veneer. Podcast hosts scrambled to record emergency episodes, calling in legal analysts, ethics professors, and former prosecutors. One ex-FBI agent said flatly, "This is an exposure. This is a declaration of war on institutional decay." A coalition of law school deans publicly called for the Department of Justice to open a full investigation into prosecutorial conduct. Overnight, a petition demanding a comprehensive internal audit of the state's judicial and law enforcement practices gathered over 700,000 signatures. Even as public outrage exploded, the institutional cracks spread faster. Kellerman's LinkedIn profile was flooded with over 20,000 formal reports in 12 hours, triggering an auto ban from the platform. His name vanished from the department's website before sunrise. At the same time, Linda Cole's ethics record was unearthed by a watchdog nonprofit, which filed an official misconduct complaint against her with the state bar. Their public report detailed a history of selective enforcement and patterned judicial influence, complete with redacted memos and anonymous testimonies. Her photo, stern and unsmiling, was juxtaposed in editorials with bold captions: "Power misused, justice denied." A digital army took shape behind the scenes. Grassroots organizers launched threads compiling all known public cases handled by Cole and Kellerman. Spreadsheet after spreadsheet emerged, each a damning indictment. Dates, rulings, inconsistencies, sealed files, missing footage. It all piled up. Each cell on the screen seemed to scream what the system had whispered for years. This wasn't new. It had just never been dragged this violently into the light. A small independent paper dropped the most explosive visual yet. A grainy but unmistakable image of Amara's FBI badge. The corner slightly bent, the nameplate gleaming against a storm gray blazer. They printed it on their front page with a single headline: "She never blinked." Copies sold out in minutes. Outside newsstands in D.C., students and parents queued at dawn to grab a copy. Professors brought it into lecture. Activists held it like a symbol. One university law department projected the video on a massive screen in the middle of campus and live-streamed an open forum on justice reform. Hundreds showed up in person. Thousands joined virtually. One professor said into the mic, "We tell our students that the law is a neutral instrument, but today they watch someone someone slice through that lie with evidence, grit, and a badge. Amara didn't comment. She stayed out of the press. She didn't repost, didn't like, didn't tweet. But her silence wasn't absence. It was presence, amplified. Every still frame of her, every clipped second of her voice, pulsed through the web like electricity through a frayed wire. Someone compiled a video montage with piano underscoring. Amara walking into court, Amara seated stone-faced as Kellerman spun lies, Amara lifting the badge with surgical precision. The video ended with a black screen and white text. Not all heroes wear capes. Some carry clearance. Talk show panels erupted into chaotic debates. Is she a rogue? One host barked. Or is she exactly what the system needed? A guest retorted, if holding liars accountable makes you rogue, maybe the system was never built to serve truth in the first place. Meanwhile, memes flooded Instagram and TikTok. One looped a clip of Cole's face twisting in shock, set to the sound of a record scratch. Caption, and that's when she knew she messed up. Another overlaid the sound of glass shattering as the gun hit the mic. Others got darker splicing, in real names of wrongfully convicted victims, juxtaposed with sound bites from Amara's testimony. Hashtags multiplied, Amara unchained, justice with teeth, badge of truth. At night, someone projected a giant version of Amara's badge onto the side of the courthouse, using a drone-mount light rig. Videos of the moment went viral under the title Shadow of Justice. No one took credit. The image loomed over the city for 3 hours before fizzling into darkness. Linda Cole's office window remained shuttered. Her voicemail overflowed. She didn't appear at work for 2 days. Sources reported she had requested private legal counsel. Her house was surrounded by unmarked security. She had gone from the shadow queen of selective prosecution to a cornered name in a national reckoning, and through it all, Amara kept working, not to be seen, but to finish. The aftermath wasn't silent. It was loaded. In the hours after the storm of hashtags, clips, and headlines, Washington didn't blink. It watched. And in that measured watching, Amara moved. With the clinical resolve of someone who had never once confused noise for power, she filed a formal petition directly to the Department of Justice. No press conference, no camera, just a hardbound dossier, sealed and signed, delivered through the correct channel at precisely 8:07 a.m. Inside were 462 pages of internal correspondence, audit trails, metadata logs, and one line that carried the weight of a nuclear detonation. Sometimes, the law needs to soften a little if you want to control people who don't know their place. That wasn't whispered hearsay. That was Linda Cole, typed in Arial 11, timestamped 11:49 p.m., sent from her work email address. A prosecutorial philosophy, naked and unashamed. The room that reviewed it didn't gasp. It didn't need to. 36 hours later, a search warrant was issued. They came for Cole at 2:26 p.m., not in the middle of the night, not with agents screaming down corridors. No, this wasn't a theater, it was a calculation. 2 federal officers walked into her office during daylight, badge out, no drama. They didn't even need to raise their voices. Cole was seated behind her desk, mid-emel, her fingers pausing on the keyboard as their shadow fell across the wood grain. She blinked once, then twice. "You can't be serious," she said, not looking at them. The taller agent responded, calm as a judge. "We are. Ma'am, we're executing a federal search warrant," she scoffed, a sharp, scornful snort that cracked the stale air. "You people think I'm the villain. You forget, I'm the one who kept the wolves at bay." Her voice was still acidic, but the corner of her left eye twitched just once. They didn't handcuff her. They didn't need to. They took her phone first, unlocked it via warrantless override, then her hard drive, then her office server access, then her drawers, her safe, her confidential case binders. Every file labeled closed was opened. Every deletion log was retrieved. Within 3 hours, the first crack appeared, a missing file from a fatal enforcement case dating back 18 months. A man dead from a no-knock raid. Body cam footage suppressed. Internal review archived. Nothing ever prosecuted. Linda Cole had signed the closure request personally, irrelevant to larger proceedings her note had read. But now it was screaming. Then came the bank data. A transfer from an auxiliary account, unregistered, disguised under the name of a third-party legal consultancy, to the personal PayPal account of Kellerman's assistant. A memo line. Field logistics. The amount wasn't astronomical. It didn't need to be. It was precise, strategic, intentional. Followed by a second transfer 3 weeks later. There was no more guessing, no more ambiguity. It wasn't just misconduct, it was a blueprint of manipulation. At HQ, when they asked her to surrender all electronic devices, Cole hesitated only a moment before handing over her phone, with the same grace she used to flick away inconvenient interns, but her fingers clenched afterward. She reached for her coffee, found it empty, and didn't drink. Her eyes didn't blink as they read through the signed document, confirming that the DOJ was now formally investigating her for 3 federal charges: conspiracy to falsify evidence, obstruction of a federal investigation, and abuse of prosecutorial authority for personal gain. It was then that someone noticed the smell of burnt toner from the adjacent printer room, probably a batch of confidential documents being shredded in panic. Cole didn't flinch. She just asked, "Is this how we reward 26 years of public service?" One of the agents, not missing a beat, replied, "No, ma'am. This is how we investigate misuse of 26 years of unchecked power." The photographs came next. Surveillance images of her meeting with Kellerman in a parking lot, one arm resting casually on the door of his car, both laughing. Time-stamped just 1 day before Amara was stopped. There was no discussion anymore of interpretation or context. There was only one fact, stacked like dominoes on fire. By the time Amara arrived for the internal conference that would determine the next phase, the air in the building had changed. People didn't meet her eyes with suspicion anymore. They watched her like gravity, undeniable and quiet. She walked past Cole, who was already seated inside a glass-walled room, hair fraying at the edges of her once immaculate bun. The makeup around her eyes had thinned, exposing the fatigue that no amount of courtroom theatrics could hide. Her right thumb tapped against her index finger rhythmically, a tick of nerves. Amara didn't slow her pace. She didn't need to. Inside the conference room, the tension was clinical. The walls didn't echo. The carpet absorbed noise, but not the consequence. Amara laid out the exhibits without narrative flair. The deleted enforcement file, the payment trail, the internal emails, the voice notes referencing controlled narratives, and the final summary. 7 prior cases showing procedural similarities. Each victim was listed by name, case ID, and year. 5 men, 2 women, all of them with files sealed prematurely, all of them with post-investigative edits not authorized by judicial review, each name a tombstone on paper, and then, to close, a single slide. Cole's now infamous quote enlarged in black and white. "Sometimes the law needs to soften a little if you want to control people who don't know their place." It wasn't shouted, it was displayed. It hung in the silence like a confession written in permanent ink. Cole didn't deny it. She didn't speak. She just stared at the floor like it had betrayed her. Her authority, once woven from flawless diction and ironclad procedure, was fraying before everyone's eyes, and she knew it. When the meeting ended, no one stood. There was no applause. There was only quiet, as if the oxygen had recalibrated. Cole was left in the room, alone, as everyone else filed out. Someone caught a photo, unintentional, not posed. It showed her sitting with both hands folded between her knees, eyes staring into the grain of the table. Her hair was no longer pinned. Her blazer was slightly rumpled. The woman who once commanded entire courts with a tilt of her chin now looked unfinished. That image would never hit the news. It didn't need to. Its truth would echo in policy papers and procedural rewrites. Because what fell that day wasn't just Linda Cole. It was the illusion that the law had only one face, and that face was always clean. Amara didn't watch Cole as the door closed behind her. She didn't look back. Power didn't need a farewell. It needed results. And justice, finally, was beginning to speak in a language louder than verdicts. Exposure. The blow didn't come from a courtroom, a badge, or a headline. It came from a single post. A profile named Zach K., minimal bio, no followers, shared a message so quiet it roared louder than any courtroom verdict. Brent Kellerman is my father. I used to believe he protected justice. I was wrong. Attached was a photo. A boy no older than 7, curled in the lap of a man in crisp police uniform, arms wrapped in pride around his son. Smile stiff, like it had been taught rather than earned. The post didn't scream. It whispered, and the country leaned in to listen. Within 8 hours, 3 million shares. Within 12, it had crossed borders, translated into 5 languages, and debated on global panels about justice, legacy, and a decay of conscience behind a badge. Zach's message wasn't a denunciation. It was an autopsy. I watched him build a career out of authority and silence. I watched him come home smelling of rage. He never unpacked. I watched how he spoke about people like Amara Blake, the words he used, the tone he saved for people who questioned him. I thought it was just how cops talk. Now I know better. Every word gutted Kellerman deeper than any judge could. It wasn't Amara who buried him. It was the one person he trained to admire him, and he had failed. The next morning, reporters swarmed the Kellerman residence, not with the urgency of scandal hunters, but the cold persistence of undertakers. Brent didn't answer the door. He didn't need to. A long lens caught him through the living room window, slumped in a recliner, face gray with absence, hands limp over the armrests. No uniform, no gun. Just a broken man, swallowed in silence. When he finally left the house, hours later, escorted into an unmarked federal vehicle, he didn't resist. He didn't speak. He didn't meet the eyes of the crowd gathering on the sidewalk. What he did do, as the door closed, was weep. The camera caught the trail of a single tear carving through a 5 o'clock shadow. It wasn't performative, it was pathetic. Inside the federal vehicle, someone snapped a photo. He in the back seat, staring blankly forward, lips parted, palms resting on his knees like a man, waiting for judgment that wouldn't come from any courtroom but from within his bloodline. That photo, too, went viral. The caption wrote itself. The badge couldn't save him. His son saw through it. In the hearing chamber, Zach's post was entered as a public exhibit. Though non-legal in form, its cultural impact was unquestionable. A senator read aloud the last line from the post while staring directly at the now disgraced officer. "I'm not afraid of what my father was. I'm afraid I'll become him." Brent Kellerman flinched. For the first time since his exposure, his entire frame shook, and when the courtroom displayed the image of his son in his lap from that childhood photo, when that innocence became Exhibit A in the dismantling of his legacy, Brent broke. Not with fury, not with a fight, but with the implosion of a man realizing that not even family had stayed blind to him. Reporters noted that he didn't attempt a rebuttal. No press statements, no counterclaims. When asked by an agent during intake processing if he wished to contact legal counsel, Brent only replied, "Is there a lawyer who can argue with your child?" He didn't ask about charges. He didn't ask about Amara. He asked only one question. Did Zach say if he's okay? The silence that followed was colder than any prison cell. In some cases, the sound of silence was more fearsome than the sound of a hammer scraping a glass. Meanwhile, the ripple spread across precincts. Officers who once called Kellerman a legend began quietly removing him from photos in locker rooms. A precinct in Jacksonville took down a plaque he once earned for excellence in public duty. Someone painted over it with 3 words in black spray, "No duty here." Cadets at the academy, where Kellerman used to guest lecture, started a petition to audit his entire training curriculum. A professor of criminal psychology referred to him as a case study in inherited authority gone cancerous. But the deepest wound wasn't institutional, it was personal. Internal Affairs leaked a text message Zach to Brent sent hours before the public post. "This isn't about hating you, it's about stopping who you've become before someone else turns into you." That message, brief and brutal, was dissected in op-eds across major publications. Some called it brave, others called it betrayal, but all agreed it was irreversible. Amara never mentioned Zach publicly. She didn't need to. The silence between them was respectful, solemn, and surgical. She understood the gravity of a child cutting the cord from the myth of their parent. In the next session of internal hearings, Amara submitted a one-page statement to accompany the social media post now logged in official records. It read simply, "Justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it walks out of a childhood memory, wounded but alive." It was signed with her badge number, not her name. By the end of that week, Brent Kellerman's police pension was revoked, his retirement benefits terminated, his federal clearance has been suspended indefinitely. The FBI formally charged him with falsifying evidence, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy under color of law. The Department of Justice added a final clause: due to conflict of interest, the defendant's familial relationship to a primary public whistleblower will be considered aggravating in sentence. That line hit the media with the force of a closing door. In quiet corners of online forums, former officers debated whether Zach's post was fair. Some said yes, it held a mirror to the system. Others called it a betrayal of blood. But the world had already chosen sides. The damage wasn't just to a man, it was to an illusion, the belief that legacy could outlive morality. Zach didn't just expose his father, he excavated a truth America had buried beneath medals and ceremonies, that silence is complicity, and complicity breeds decay. 1 week later, an anonymous package arrived at a local community center in Zach's neighborhood. Inside was a folded note and a medal, the same police commendation Brent had once shown on TV interviews, polished and gleaming. The note read, "I don't need this anymore. I'd rather my son be proud of me than my department." No signature, just the weight of metal and guilt. Zach, when contacted by NPR, refused a full interview. He only gave one line for publication: "There are some legacies worth ending. Mine begins with truth." The silence left by Zach's final words had not yet settled when the next rupture arrived. This time in the form of ink on paper, signed under the seal of the Department of Justice. The indictment was read aloud on national television. 5 federal charges. The names: Brent Kellerman, Linda Cole. The offenses: conspiracy to obstruct justice, falsification of federal evidence, abuse of prosecutorial authority, willful suppression of civil rights, and finally, perjury under oath. The camera didn't blink. Neither did the public. For the first time in decades, a dual prosecution of a senior federal prosecutor and a decorated law enforcement officer was not only authorized, it was televised. Outside the Department of Justice headquarters in D.C., a wall of reporters stood in a standoff formation, each delivering their lines in tandem to dozens of networks. Historic, they called it, unprecedented. But to the victims who had lived beneath the boots of these two names, it was late. Still, not too late. Inside the special hearing room, a white binder landed on the evidence table with a weight that reverberated down the wooden frame. 342 pages. No foreword, no index, just a handwritten line on the first page in ink that had not yet fully dried. "If I stay silent, they will keep going." It was Amara's only message. She didn't testify. She didn't sit on the panel. She stood in the back corner, expression unreadable, arms crossed, not in protest, but in presence. The document she submitted contained 12 pieces of evidence previously unreleased to the public: video excerpts redacted from original body cam files, voice transcriptions from encrypted devices, and time-stamped communications between Cole and a closed group of prosecutors. It documented not just bias, it documented the design, a pattern of manipulation crafted to appear procedural, legal abuse disguised as bureaucratic routine. Not once did it name racism outright, but every sentence screamed its presence in a whisper too disciplined to ignore. Cole entered the hearing room 30 minutes late. Her stride was too controlled, her smile frozen at the corners. When she approached the media gauntlet, her mouth twitched into what could have passed for confidence, if not for the slight tremor in her fingers. She didn't wave, she didn't answer questions, she didn't have to. The tension in her jaw was its testimony. Inside, when her name was read aloud next to the charges, she blinked 3 times and sat down slowly. Her lawyer reached for her arm, but she shook him off like static. Kellerman was escorted into the courtroom through a private entry. No uniform, no handcuffs, but the absence of both was louder than their presence. His eyes, once cold with control, now darted from face to face like a man no longer certain of the script. When he passed Amara's spot near the rear wall, he paused. Not long, but long enough for cameras to catch it. Their eyes met. She didn't flinch. He blinked first. His seat at the defendant's table might as well have been a confession booth. When the charges were formally read aloud, neither defendant interrupted. Cole tried to scribble notes but kept misspelling simple words. Kellerman fidgeted with a loose thread on his sleeve until a marshal quietly motioned for him to stop. The judge presiding over the hearing, a woman known for her impartiality but not for leniency, kept her voice even. Due to the volume and gravity of the evidence submitted, the court is compelled to proceed with formal indictment. No applause, just breath held. A pause in the room followed, thick, static charged. And then the press pool erupted outside. Live streams multiplied. Hashtags cross-pollinated. News stations played the footage of Amara submitting her dossier on a loop. On MSNBC, a chyron read, "The Reckoning," page by page. On CNN, accountability arrived. But it was on a small indie news site where the moment found its sharpest blade. They zoomed into the handwritten note on Amara's binder and superimposed it over footage of the indictment. "If I stay silent, they will keep going." Back inside the DOJ, a press liaison began reading the official summary of charges. Unlike the courtroom, this wasn't for law. It was for the record. The voice was clear, toneless, brutal. Linda Cole is charged with knowingly coordinating the manipulation of prosecutorial documentation, exerting pressure to obscure exculpatory evidence, and intentionally disrupting the chain of evidentiary integrity for cases under federal review. Brent Kellerman is charged with conspiring in these efforts and abusing his authority to plant evidence and falsify investigative outcomes. 12 minutes into the summary broadcast, the DOJ's website crashed under traffic. The crowd outside doubled. A drone camera flew overhead, capturing the moment the building's rotunda lights flickered on and bathed the entrance in harsh fluorescence. In a frozen frame that later ran on the cover of a dozen newspapers, Cole is seen walking down the steps with her mouth slightly open, her lips stiff, her hair windless in still air. She's not smiling, but she's trying to, and that effort, futile, performative, and transparent, became the symbol of collapse. Commentators noted that it wasn't a show trial, it wasn't a theater, it was a system forced to publicly process its own rot. And unlike the past, it wasn't protected by jargon or red tape. The DOJ's language was plain, the evidence was unredacted, and the public had front-row seats to the reckoning. Meanwhile, Amara's role remained fixed in shadow. She refused all interviews. She declined a book deal. She didn't stand at the podium. She didn't need to. She had built the kind of case that speaks for itself, not in rhetoric, but in receipts. Not in anger, but in irrefutable data. The binder had done more damage than 1,000 protests, because it made a system collapse under its weight, quietly, surgically, without spectacle. The last act of the day came not from a courtroom, but from a desk. At precisely 6:02 p.m., the Department of Justice released the formal version of the indictment to the public record. 46 pages, signed by both the Deputy Attorney General and the Director of Federal Investigations. The signature page was broadcast live on cable television, anchors pausing their commentary as the DOJ's communications officer confirmed, "This document is now entered into the Federal Register. The state is prosecuting both defendants to the full extent of the law." Kellerman's signature appeared shaky. Cole's was missing. Her lawyer had signed on her behalf. That evening, as rain pattered across the Capitol dome, pundits dissected the day's significance while the public reacted in real time. Kellerman's face trended beside Cole's on all major platforms, not as villains in uniform, but as architects of oppression disguised as officials. Yet Amara's name wasn't attached to either. It didn't need to be. Her impact existed between the folds of every page, in every time-stamped message, in every misspelled excuse red circled in the margins. Inside a private conference room later that night, Amara met briefly with a DOJ official tasked with future oversight reforms. She handed him a second folder, smaller, no inscription. Inside, preliminary findings on other patterns, cases not yet public, names not yet exposed. She left without comment, but taped to the inside cover was a single post-it note in her handwriting. "This isn't the end, it's only the first indictment." The official didn't speak. He just nodded, then picked up the folder like it might burn him if he held it too long. Outside, the storm grew louder. Inside, the wheels had finally begun to turn the right way. History wouldn't remember this moment because someone shouted the loudest. It would be remembered because someone refused to stay quiet. Because in a system built on sealed records and sealed lips, one voice had opened the door and left it unlocked. The folder had barely left her hands before the retaliation began. It started quietly, the way decay starts beneath a painted wall, unseen until it spreads. 3 days after the indictment, a plain white envelope arrived at Amara's doorstep with no return address, no markings except her name scrawled in all caps. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in black ink. "You think taking down 2 of us ends it? There are more. We are everywhere." Folded inside was a photo of her daughter at age 7, the same image once kept locked in a drawer at home. Someone had been inside. That evening, the tires of her car were sprayed with crimson paint, each door tagged with the word traitor in capital letters. Her home security camera, state-of-the-art, encrypted, motion-sensitive, was shattered with one clean blow. Not stolen, not obscured, destroyed. As if to say, "We are not hiding." Amara reviewed the footage backwards until the last clear frame. A man in a hoodie staring directly into the lens, holding a crowbar like a handshake offered in hate. No mask, no fear. She didn't go on TV. She didn't give a quote. Instead, she uploaded a copy of the entire IA-233 case file to 3 international human rights watchdogs, time-stamped, metadata intact, with a single-line email. "If anything happens to me, this is the reason why." Then she recorded a 30-second video, no background music, no editing, just her looking straight into the camera. "I am Special Agent Amara Blake. If I disappear, it's not voluntary. Start with this file, and do not stop." The clip was sent directly to a secure cloud server and flagged with emergency dissemination protocols. If she didn't check in within 72 hours, it would auto-publish to over 50 digital outlets worldwide. Redundancy wasn't paranoia, it was policy. And Amara followed the policy like the gospel. The next morning, a report landed in her encrypted inbox from the Cybercrime Division. An anonymous account had uploaded a deep fake using courtroom footage. Her voice overlaid with fabricated statements that made her sound unhinged, erratic, and unprofessional. The caption read, "FBI fraud exposed." It had been viewed over 800,000 times in 12 hours. Comment sections were filled with threats, coded, direct, sarcastic, but all violent in implication. One read, "She won't make it to trial." Another simply posted a bullet emoji. Meanwhile, on a hidden forum tracked by the Domestic Extremism Task Force, her image had been pinned to a digital corkboard with the title, "Targets of the Deep State." It was accompanied by a crude edit of her face, imposed over a firing range target. A user posted, "We got her car model, waiting for shift change." Underneath, a second user replied with a still from a nearby traffic cam, Amara driving alone, time-stamped 2 days prior. She didn't change her route. She didn't request an escort detail. She showed up to work wearing the same tailored navy vest, but beneath it, she now wore level 3A Kevlar. It didn't make her invincible. It made her precise. Bulletproof fabric wasn't for courage. It was for clarity. Her presence in the field now said one thing: "I am not afraid to be hunted, but I will not be easy prey." One of the more chilling discoveries came from a routine security sweep of the DOJ parking structure. Reviewing low-frequency motion data, analysts uncovered footage from a week earlier, a figure trailing Amara by exactly 7 seconds, walking just far enough behind her to remain in blind spots, never close enough to trigger alerts. No confrontation, no communication, just a presence, a slow echo of her steps. When the stills were enhanced, the man's face was half lit, unfamiliar but deliberate. Not a fan, not a stranger, something worse, calculated. At lunch that day, she sat alone in the bureau cafeteria. Conversations dimmed around her, not in rejection but reverence. Respect blended with apprehension. Everyone had read the headlines. Everyone knew, but no one wanted to say it aloud. Someone had placed a target on the back of the woman who had exposed the system's rot from the inside. And yet, there she sat, biting into an apple, scrolling through forensic reports, wearing a Kevlar vest like it was business attire. Power, they realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it just refused to blink. She received another anonymous message that night, delivered through an encrypted Dropbox used by bureau insiders. No sender, no metadata, just a text file with 10 words. They're watching your daughter's school now. Change nothing. Speak nothing. The threat didn't name names. It didn't have to. The weight was in the implication, the sickness of control disguised as advice. She stared at the screen for 12 minutes, unmoving. Then she shut the laptop, opened her secure drawer, and slipped her holster on beneath her blazer. She didn't tell anyone. Not her supervisor, not the security unit, not the DOJ liaison. Silence was her statement. It was also her shield, because saying the wrong name too early would tip the enemy off, and she understood now. This wasn't just blowback, it was a coordinated recalibration of power. Somewhere in the system, a tether had snapped, and the ones who built it were scrambling to fuse it shut with threats, illusions, and fear. The fear didn't work. Instead, Amara began a second file, privately, offline. No cloud sync, no traceable metadata. She titled it Contingency Layer. It held incident logs, street footage, audio snapshots, and license plate traces. Not yet a case, but the beginning of one. Patterns emerged. The same black van on 3 different intersections. A courier service that didn't exist. Digital fingerprints rerouted through legacy systems retired years ago. She wasn't cataloging for protection. She was preparing a prosecution. 3 nights later, someone rang her doorbell at 3:14 AE Mamming. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They stood in the shadows just outside camera range. Not masked, just faceless, waiting. Amara didn't open the door. She didn't call 911. She stared through the peephole, breathing slowly and even until the figure vanished into the dark. In the morning, a sticky note was found on the windshield of her car. Truth has a cost. You've paid half. She kept the note. She bagged it, she logged it, and then she got in the car and drove to work. She didn't flinch when she entered the office that morning. Her gait was unbroken, her pace exact. Her colleagues noticed the subtle change, slightly broader shoulders beneath the blazer, the stiffness of armor just beneath fine wool. She didn't bring up the threads. She brought paperwork. She didn't name suspects. She updated protocols. The only acknowledgement she made was a memo to Internal Affairs requesting a full audit of all FBI-issued surveillance equipment active within 20 miles of her home. Midweek, one of the Bureau's junior agents approached her in the hallway, voice trembling, eyes darting. He handed her a printout, comments scraped from a shadow group forum hidden deep inside the dark web. Phrases like, "She's not bulletproof" everywhere, and "Someone's got her schedule" littered the page. Amara thanked him, nodded once, and fed the paper through the shredder without reading a word. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford, and she wouldn't give them the spectacle of fear. Instead, she placed a quiet call to a contact in the Tactical Response Division, someone she trusted from her years in field ops. A simple request: monitor external chatter without triggering defensive alarms. The response came 2 hours later, via encrypted ping. Your enemies are still guessing. They haven't penetrated your core systems, but you've spooked them. That was enough. Not reassurance, just confirmation that the war had become visible. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was watching them. On Friday, she met with a representative from a global civil liberties group. They had received her earlier evidence drop and requested a follow-up conversation, not to profile her, but to understand the scale of systemic decay from her perspective. She didn't bring emotion. She brought data, heat maps, timeline overlays, internal approval chains, a detailed schema of how silence had been codified into structure. The representative listened, silent, scribbling. Then they said, "This isn't just exposure, this is architecture." The architect that night, Amara received a second video short, pixelated, time-stamped. It showed her daughter, walking home from school, briefly pausing at a crosswalk. Behind her, a man adjusted his baseball cap. He didn't follow, he didn't speak, but he smiled into the camera like he knew it was there, like he wanted her to know. There's no audio, no demand, just footage, just an implication, the most calculated kind of violence, the kind that doesn't act, only promises. She forwarded the file to the Bureau of Threat Assessment, but not before duplicating it, archiving it, and isolating the IP trace. When a system fails to protect you, you become your firewall. She added a new page to the contingency layer, labeled it Phase 2, Family Involved. Her keystrokes were slow, exact, detached. This wasn't trauma, this was logistics. She wasn't documenting for memory, she was preparing for leverage. Every detail was a potential nail in the coffin of whoever was foolish enough to think she could be threatened into silence. The moment Amara stepped through the marble-framed threshold of the congressional hearing room, the silence was louder than any applause. She didn't flash a badge, she didn't state her title, but every pair of eyes in the chamber, senators, aides, journalists, and janitors alike, rose in quiet unison, not in protocol, in recognition. No gavel struck, no cue was needed. The room simply stood as if the oxygen had shifted, as if her presence recalibrated the gravity in the chamber. Her vest was plain, no insignia, no gold embroidery, yet the fabric carried the weight of every injustice she had shattered. The chairwoman of the Judiciary Committee blinked rapidly as Amara approached the witness table. There was no nameplate, no prepared speech, just a worn leather notebook placed with deliberate care on the polished oak surface. Amara opened it with a flick of her fingers, paused, then read in a voice low but unmistakably resonant, "On May 18, 2002, a man named Jermaine T. Holloway wrote from a federal holding cell. I am not against police. I am against the impersonation of justice. One wears a gun, the other wears a mask." She looked up. Some shifted uncomfortably. One aide swallowed hard. Amara closed the notebook gently, as if sealing the past in its rightful place, and added, "I don't need anyone here to apologize for what happened. I only need every one of you to make sure it never happens again." The room didn't erupt. It exhaled. Slowly, collectively, like lungs being allowed to breathe truth after decades of filtered lies. A second later, the microphone in front of her clicked off. Whether by technical failure or nervous intent, no one knew. But Amara didn't miss a beat. She stepped slightly forward, voice still steady, tone sharpened not by volume but by clarity. "Silence," she said, "has been the favored weapon of every system that wishes to endure without scrutiny. You can cut the mic, you cannot cut consequences." Her words hung in the air like a courtroom verdict, irreversible and exact. Across the room, one of the junior representatives, barely 30, bowed his head, not in shame, but as if acknowledging something larger than law. Another clutched the edge of the desk like a lifeline. The woman in the second row, whose brother had once faced trial under a judge now under federal review, covered her mouth with both hands. Tears didn't fall loudly. They landed on folded notes, on printed agenda, on the skin of people who suddenly remembered they had hearts. She didn't push further. She didn't raise a fist. She simply stood there as a fact made flesh. Behind her, a single journalist captured the moment in one still frame. Amara in front of a muted mic, her eyes locked with the camera, unblinking. Within hours, the image had replaced campaign logos and protest banners across social feeds, captioned only with her own words, "You can cut the mic, you cannot cut consequences." After the hearing adjourned, people didn't rush out. They lingered. uncertain whether to resume the routine or absorb what had just occurred. A retired federal judge, once notorious for dismissing police misconduct cases, stood up from the far corner. His gait was slower now, his eyes shadowed by the weight of decisions past. He walked the full length of the room, ignoring cameras and aides, and extended a hand to Amara. "You reminded us," he said, voice gravel thick, "that power is only real when it fears losing itself." She didn't reply. She just shook his hand with the same firmness she'd used the day she swore her oath. Outside the chamber, reporters surged toward the door, but no one dared shout questions. She didn't wave, didn't stop. Her silence now echoed louder than press conferences. It told a story no one could twist. She had walked into the belly of the legislative beast, unarmed, unapologetic, and undeniable. By nightfall, every major network aired the hearing. The segment wasn't long, just 3 minutes and 47 seconds, but it was looped until it became liturgy. Analysts tried to dissect her tone. Pundits debated policy reform, but none of them could replicate the stillness she had left behind, the kind of stillness born not from absence, but from presence, so complete it emptied the room of denial. In the following days, no badge was shown, yet the doors opened. No subpoenas were issued, yet files began to move. Behind closed doors, committees scheduled emergency reviews. Whistleblowers who had sat in fear for years began submitting anonymous testimonies to oversight boards, citing only the timestamp of Amara's speech as their turning point. Her testimony had not been a call to arms, it had been a mirror. And no one in power likes the way corruption looks when reflected, without distortion. Cole, under continued investigation, reportedly threw a chair during a private DOJ inquiry session. Kellerman, now indicted and awaiting trial, requested a change in legal counsel. Inside the Bureau, a new initiative was drafted, one not built around surveillance, but around safeguarding internal accountability. They named it Directive Holloway, after the man whose words Amara had chosen to echo. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The justice system was finally listening, because someone had stopped asking it politely. Amara remained in the background. She declined interviews, declined awards, declined all the trappings of being a symbol. She wasn't interested in being honored. She was interested in being remembered by the silence she shattered. And from that day on, when she entered a room, no one needed to ask who she was. No badge, no speech, just her presence, enough to reset the rules. The lights in the studio were dimmed just enough to let the screens behind Amara glow with neutral blues and grays. She sat center frame, no makeup, crew adjustments, no polished PR gloss, just her steady gaze and the calm that had become more piercing than outrage. The host, a seasoned journalist known for grilling senators into submission, sat across from her, with his notepad untouched, eyes lowered, as if trying to anchor himself before the next wave came. He knew when to look. She didn't wait for the cue. "I'm not here to be believed," she said, the words not thrown but placed, like truth on the table between them. "I just want to be heard, because no one needs to look like me to recognize what was done was wrong." There was no monologue, no music bed, just a 7-second silence where the host blinked twice and nodded. The cameras rolled, but the usual rhythm of television was absent. No transition graphics, no studio laughter to cut the tension. What aired that night was not an interview. It was a reckoning in real time. Amara spoke little, but what she said traveled faster than outrage and cut deeper than hashtags. "Justice is not a feeling," she continued. "It's not about sympathy or sentiment. Justice is action, consequence, correction. We've got this, and we really..." Within 2 hours, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, all usually allergic to unity, re-aired the segment, back-to-back, stripped of political commentary. Even Fox' late-night panel simply paused, letting the footage speak without overlaying their usual cynicism. Social media exploded not with analysis, but with commitment. By sunrise, 3.4 million people had registered as volunteers for community justice audits, civic legal watch groups, and pro bono case research efforts. The systems people used to whisper about were no longer shadows in the dark. They were headline agenda items, school debate topics, and kitchen table questions. The host of the show, after the cameras cut, reportedly removed his microphone and whispered, "You just rewrote how we do this." He didn't say goodbye. He stood up and watched her leave. By midnight, network logos were replaced with black and white stills of Amra's silhouette under the studio lights, captioned simply, "Integrity without permission." Professors began posting assignments based on her phrasing. Schools of law in 5 states placed her photo beside landmark legal figures not for her rank, but for her reminder that change doesn't wear medals. It wears endurance. In the following week, the Justice Department released a rare statement acknowledging the critical role played by individual accountability in institutional correction. It didn't mention Amara by name. It didn't need to. The public did that part. Thousands of handwritten letters, not emails, poured into public offices quoting her lines verbatim. Judges read them aloud before trials. Prosecutors pinned them beside court briefings. And Amara? She didn't tweet. She didn't post a recap. She boarded a red bye back to her field office and clocked in the next morning, badge unread, armor beneath the fabric as always, because her fight had never been for exposure. It had been for the exposure of the truth. She didn't need a stage. The country had become her courtroom, and for once, it was listening. The day was ordinary in every visible way. Clouds gathered in disinterested bunches above the red brick school, and the front lawn, freshly cut, smelled like possibility. Amara had spoken for only 23 minutes. No podium, no badges, no elaborate biography, just her voice, clipped and steady, echoing through the gymnasium walls lined with laminated banners and college pennants. Her message was direct. You don't have to wait for permission to matter. After the applause faded, students broke into clusters, some buzzing with questions, others too stunned to speak. It wasn't until Amara was stepping down from the stage, her heels clicking against the hardwood, that the quietest moment roared the loudest. A girl no taller than Amara's hip, with skin the shade of roasted chestnut and braids tied in neon elastics, approached. She looked up, eyes wide with something too old to be wonder and too soft to be defiant. "Ma'am," the girl began, voice trembling but deliberate, "I'm black too, but I talk slowly. Can I still be FBI like you?" The room paused, not because it heard her, but because it felt her. Amara didn't smile out of reflex. She knelt slowly, knees brushing the gym floor, and took the girl's small hands into her own. The hush around them grew dense, reverent. Amara's voice dropped into something close to sacred. "You don't need to be like me," she said. "You just need to make sure you're never like them." The girl blinked, unsure whether to nod or cry. Amara leaned in, kissed the back of the girl's hand, gently, purposefully, and added, "You're going to do things I haven't even dared to dream yet." The flood was silent but absolute. Parents standing by the bleachers wiped tears without shame. A teacher discreetly tapped her phone, capturing the exchange, not for virality, but for history. The video, raw and unedited, made its way online within hours. It didn't need hashtags. It didn't need captions. The footage spoke fluently in the language of legacy. By morning, the clip had reached over 1 million shares. But more remarkable was the response. Thousands of messages from children, teachers, public defenders, and retired officers. One tweet from a former judge in Arkansas simply read, "That girl just rewrote the recruitment manual." A week later, the school board convened in an emergency session. Without dissent, they renamed the auditorium Amara Hall. The plaque beneath the new lettering bore no official title, just a sentence carved in steel. "Integrity is not how loud you speak, it's how deeply you're heard." And still, Amara did not post about it. She didn't attend the naming ceremony. She sent no press release. Instead, she replied to the girl's handwritten note, sent in blue crayon with a single line typed on formal stationery. "I meant it." From that day forward, whenever Amara entered a space, whether a briefing room or a courtroom, someone inevitably recognized her. But it was never the usual type of recognition. No selfies, no applause, just nods, deep, long, wordless nods that said, "We see it now. We see ourselves now." She had not planned for that moment with the child. She had not scripted her answer. But something ancient had moved through her. the kind of truth that chooses its vessel, not the other way around. And for the first time since this war of silence and symbols began, Amara felt something crack inside her. Not fear, not rage, but room. Room for another voice, another chapter, another girl who talked slow but heard fast, and would one day speak so clearly the system would tremble. Because revolution doesn't always start with sirens. Sometimes it begins with a question no one expected, and an answer no one dares to forget. The door clicked shut behind her with the kind of softness that didn't ask for permission to end something. The office was unchanged, dimly lit, minimally furnished, still bearing the faint trace of burnt coffee and paperwork too old to matter, but too important to throw away. Amara walked in without urgency. This time, no eyes were watching, no questions pressed through wires, no weight hanging from headlines, only her and the quiet. She reached for the safe, its lock familiar to her fingertips, not from memory but muscle. With a quiet click, the badge rested inside, not retired, just at rest, not hidden, just not needed, for now. She slid open the drawer of her desk and retrieved the notebook, worn and weathered at the spine, its cover still stamped with the initials IA-233. Her pen didn't hesitate. She wrote only a few lines. Closure isn't always noise. Sometimes it's just knowing they can't lie without someone keeping the record open. She closed the journal slowly, set it gently back in the drawer, then stood and let the silence fill every corner of the room, like a slow breath held too long. Outside the window, the night hadn't yet thickened, but the streetlights were already humming. Amara walked to the balcony and slid open the glass door. The wind didn't bite. It carried instead a strange warmth, the kind that lingers after a storm. When the threat is gone, but everything still remembers, she stepped out, her heels tapping once on the concrete floor, and leaned against the railing. From this height, the city felt distant but alive, like a beast sleeping with one eye open. She stared at the skyline, at the outlines of buildings etched in orange neon and steel reflection, then closed her eyes just long enough to feel the weight of the moment settle without sinking her. The past hadn't vanished. It had simply been unmasked. They would rebuild what they could, deny what they must, reframe what they couldn't, delete. But Amara knew there was no rewinding the reckoning. It had been recorded, broadcast, translated into hashtags and legislation, whispered into microphones by people who once thought no one would listen. It wasn't vengeance she'd delivered. It wasn't even justice in the cleanest sense. It was undeniable, the irreversible. And in this city, that was more than most ever got. She opened her eyes again. They don't need to fear me, she murmured. They only need to fear what they once buried and can't bury again. The notebook rested on the table like an artifact dug out of a buried era, and Amara moved toward the balcony. She didn't need air, she needed altitude. The city unfolded beneath her, its jagged sprawl lit in fragmented halos from cheap streetlights and glossier office towers. From above, injustice always looked too quiet, too mundane to be dangerous. But she'd seen its anatomy. She'd stared into the hands that wrote fake reports, edited footage, and offered cold smiles as they drew blood from the innocent. And those hands trembled now, not because they feared punishment, but because someone had dared to write it down. She leaned on the rail, whispering to herself more than the city, "They were never afraid of who I was. They were terrified someone like me would stop asking for permission." Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a single message from a former agent she once admired but could no longer trust. "You did what I never could." Amara read it once, then locked the screen down and walked to the balcony. The city below buzzed with the same indifference it wore every day, but tonight it felt thinner, like a curtain had been drawn back and the stage behind it was still clearing smoke. Amara leaned on the rail, the wind catching a strand of her hair, brushing it across her cheek like a memory too old to name. The skyline blinked back at her. Lights, movement, life, and buried within all of it, the lives that didn't make the news, the names never spoken aloud, the stories paved over in legalese. She whispered, "Not to be heard but to leave it behind. "They don't need to fear me," she said. "They only need to fear what they once buried and can't bury again." There was no music, no overture of vindication, just that quiet declaration, like a fingerprint pressed against glass. Inside, the light dimmed further. One frame on the desk, a photograph, untouched for years, caught the edge of the street lamp. It showed a younger Amara, standing not in front of power but beside absence, her face unreadable even then. Behind her, a wall lined with folders, all closed. Justice was sealed in silence. Now those folders had names, evidence, pages that wouldn't burn, voices that couldn't be erased. That was the difference. That was why they watched her now. Not because she screamed, because she didn't have to. Her silence had never been submission, it had been study. And when she spoke, it was never to speak louder, only sharper. She turned from the balcony, the night trailing off her shoulders, in her inbox already full of offers, interviews, and appointments. But she opened none. Instead, she wrote one line in an encrypted draft folder. "If they write history, I'll write footnotes, and I'll make sure the margins bleed." Then she shut the screen and, with it, the invitation to be anyone's version of herself but her own. But beside it, unaware that one day she'd be asked to drag it out by the roots. As she turned to re-enter, her fingers paused on the doorframe. Her breath was steady but deep, as though letting go of something heavy, not pain, not bitterness, just the war song of constant awareness. She had kept the record open. She had reminded the system it was being watched, even when it thought it had the upper hand. From the office corner, a small red recording light blinked off. By the time the morning broadcast had concluded, the streets near Capitol Square had fallen into an odd quiet, not the silence of dawn or the hush of reverence, but a stillness reserved for aftermaths. Something unnameable shifted in the air, a crack in what once felt immovable. Screens replayed her silhouette like a slow chant, a loop not meant to entertain but to anchor. And in corners of the country no one had thought to watch, a reckoning began to spread. No thunder, no riots, just alignment. The kind of alignment that grows in data, in timestamps, in unsent drafts people had saved just in case. And in that hush came a ripple. A state judge in Arizona, once praised for her firm stance on sentencing, found her past ruling pasted across bus shelters, annotated by a local art student who had discovered a 32-point inconsistency between her verdict and the official transcript. She tried to refute it live on camera, but her voice trembled under the footage that followed, showing her at a fundraiser shaking hands with a lobbyist she'd denied knowing under oath. 3 days later, she requested medical leave. In a church in Savannah, a group of parishioners stood and turned their backs when their former police chief was invited to speak on community protection. The live stream cut out mid-sentence, but not before a child's voice echoed clearly, "Is that the man who said Mom shouldn't ask questions?" The footage resurfaced that evening, edited only to add captions for the death. By morning, the church issued an apology, but not to the man. At a corporate law firm in downtown Chicago, an assistant printed a document of internal case transfers, walked into the senior partner's office, and placed it on the glass table between them. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. It only took 4 highlighted names for the partner to step down, citing a need for reflection, just as protesters began gathering outside their marble lobby. Meanwhile, in a quiet neighborhood just north of Portland, the mailbox of a former FBI liaison started overflowing with copies of the same page, one from the IA-233 file, the line where it states, "Collusion inferred through pattern and omission remains collusion nonetheless." He called it harassment. The reporters called it poetic. But none of those moments trended like the clip from Monroe Elementary, where a teacher asked her 5th-grade students to write down what justice looked like. One girl stood, held her notebook, and said, "It looks like someone who doesn't yell but makes everyone else go quiet." When asked what she meant, she said, "It looks like her." Cameras caught the board behind her, 4 words in messy marker. Amara made it matter. That image went viral in 8 languages. What had started as a backlash became a correction. What had started as a spectacle became policy. People didn't wear her face. They didn't sell T-shirts. They printed screenshots of her original affidavit and highlighted the lines that broke the rhythm of power. Cities began releasing internal memos, not because they had to, but because someone might ask. People stopped deleting their emails. In a university administration building, a former dean's inbox was turned over voluntarily by her secretary. "Just in case," she said, without being prompted. In a late-night segment, a comedian tried to joke about the movement, but froze when the studio audience stayed silent. The punchline never landed. The clip was retweeted 500,000 times, not for the joke, but for the moment he looked straight at the camera and said, "Maybe this one's not funny." Changes came quietly, but they came. Review boards were formed. Anonymous drop boxes were filled. Whistleblowers found safe inboxes, and no one asked for credit. And somewhere beneath all the momentum, a single idea kept surfacing. Truth, especially when buried, leaves fingerprint. That week, the House Subcommittee on Ethics received an unexpected influx of documents from retired civil servants. Unsolicited, uncoordinated, but uncannily aligned. They bore no headers. Only one phrase appeared in the footnotes of each page. "For the record." She had made records sacred again. She had reminded people that the slowest stories are sometimes the ones that finish strongest. And when the first internal memo went viral, the one that simply stated, "Her presence complicates things," the phrase was repurposed into a badge of honor. Complication became courage. Disruption became defense. And wherever rooms closed ranks, someone now paused to ask, is this going to go IA? Not out of fear, but out of foresight. Because she had taught them the difference. Not between right and wrong, but between hidden and exposed. Between assumed silence and chosen memory. And so when the cameras faded, when the lights cooled and the inboxes settled, her effect remained. Not in headlines, not even in whispers, but in the careful, calculated way people began to document everything. She had made the most powerful act of all. She had made a note of a form of protest. And that was when the new phrase began to circulate. Not written in law, but spoken in caution. Passed between those who understood what it meant to be seen completely. They meant, don't provoke someone who might just be keeping receipts. One of the junior staffers in the Department of Internal Oversight updated her screensaver, a still of Amara's hand closing her badge drawer. Not raising it, closing it. The new metaphor wasn't exposure, it was restraint that knew its weight. And somewhere in a precinct far from the noise, an officer paused mid-report, erased a false line and typed in the truth. Not because he expected a medal, but because he now feared a future where the lie would be archived next to his name. That was how Amara moved now, without motion. Her impact wasn't measured in shouts, but in the recalibration of instincts, the quiet edits, the unspoken second thoughts. She had left them with doubt, and in the hollow it carved, truth finally had a place to echo. Inside the office, Amara returned to her desk, her shadow falling long and lean across the wooden floor as the last amber light of dusk spilled through the glass. She opened the drawer, not hurried, not hesitant. From it, she retrieved the first journal from IA, 233, creased at the edges, margins marked with years of not just notes but battle lines. She didn't flip through it. She knew every entry. Her fingers lingered on the inside cover, then reached for a black pen. She wrote a single new line. It was never about what they did. It was about who still believed they could. Then she closed the journal, placed it back, and locked the drawer. One click, final. She moved to the window, unfastened the latch, and stepped out onto the narrow balcony. The wind was cool, not sharp, just enough to remind the city it was being watched. Buildings blinked their usual lights. Traffic whispered below. But tonight felt like the sky had adjusted its weight, just slightly, in her favor. She exhaled, deep, once. Her hands rested on the railing, the city stretching far and silent, unaware it was being forgiven, one piece at a time. She didn't wear her badge. She didn't wear her title. But every fiber of her posture spoke what she no longer needed to announce. This is the cost of truth, and I paid it. Somewhere behind her, a distant printer ticked once. Email notifications lit screens. The Federal Archive recorded its automatic backup. But she remained still, a presence, not a motion. She didn't move until a timer on her desk chimed once, softly, like a whisper. She walked back inside, turned off the lights one by one. The office dimmed to blue shadows. Before she stepped away for good, she reached toward a small recorder, set atop a case file, pressed play. Her voice, colder, younger, filled the space. This is not a story of innocence stolen. This is the record of silence resisted. She didn't pause it. She walked out as it continued. And on the security feed, her outline moved down the corridor, slow and clear, not turning back. Outside, the city didn't cheer. It didn't rise. It is simply remembered. And the voice continued, even after she was gone, carrying forward not because it had to, but because it had been built to last. Her chair stayed empty. The lights stayed off. But on the desk, beside the locked badge drawer, a single post-it note remained. No signature, no explanation, just 4 words in firm ink. Do not erase this. As the screen faded to black, a final breath was heard. Hers, steady, closing the arc. Then silence. Then a single line, white on black. Justice does not need to shout. It only needs to remain.